Hi, everyone. Does anyone recognize this calendar, and does anyone know what it is? Yes. Yeah, exactly. So this is the cosmic calendar. It's basically a method to visualize the chronology of the universe, compressing the universe's 13.8 billion year history into a single calendar year. The concept was popularized by Carl Sagan in his book, The Dragons of Eden, and also on his television series, The Cosmos. And up in the far left, we have the Big Bang, which happened on the first second of January 1st. And down in the bottom right corner, we have our current day. This is our present time, midnight on December 1st, or December 31st. And each month is about 1.2 billion years long. Each day equals 40 million years. And each second stands for some 500 years, basically the blinking of an eye in the drama of cosmic time. On this scale, the Milky Way disk was formed around May 15th. The solar system and the Earth were formed around September 2nd. Dinosaurs appeared around December 25th, and they went extinct around December 30th. On the last day, in the last minute, at about 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 30 seconds, human beings began domesticating animals and plants, and they started settling into agricultural societies and eventually permanent cities. Now, everything in our recorded history, every person that we've ever heard of, everyone from Jesus to Buddha to Muhammad, the emperors of dynastic China, all of that happened in this little black dot. All of recorded history happened in the last 10 seconds of the cosmic calendar. Now, this was all for us, right? That's what most people thought, and that's what we thought for most of our history, and that's what some people still think today, even in the face of extraordinary evidence to the contrary. Now, one thing is for sure, and that is humans have an extremely bad sense of time, especially when it comes to anything longer than a human lifespan, and certainly when it comes to deep time. It took us many thousands of years to discover the fact of evolution, the extremely gradual but undeniably strong force of change, which is responsible for our existence. And the fact is that we really have trouble understanding anything with the slightest bit of immensity. Now, the problem that we're facing in the animal rights movement is one of immense and completely incomprehensible proportions. We all happen to be born to witness the rise of factory farming. Our societies breed, confine, abuse, and kill sentient animals for our palates each year, whose numbers are well into the trillions. Now, trillions is just a number that nobody in this room can comprehend. It's just absolutely an incomprehensible number. Just to give you an idea of what a trillion really is, if you spent $1 million every single day since the day Jesus was born, you would not have even come close to spending $1 trillion. So these numbers that we're killing animals in, sadly, are increasing. And when you look at these numbers alone, it can be pretty disheartening, especially for all of us who dedicate our short and precious time towards ending this atrocity. And I certainly know how hopeless this can feel. I'm 34 years old, and I've been in the movement for 17 years. It's literally half of my life. I spent this protesting, spending hours out in all types of weather extremities, leafleting, going to jail, having friends and family laugh at me, coming to these same conferences every year, hearing the same things over and over. And, sometimes I think to myself, what the hell am I doing? What are we doing? Are we doing anything right? Is there any hope for animals at all. When I start to feel this certain mood, I really have to stop and remind myself that the fact is, just like cosmic time and biological evolution, social change is an extremely gradual process. And it happens on timescales that are very hard for us to perceive, especially with good understanding. So what I'd like to do today is to ask you to just zoom out for a minute and take a look with me at the calendars of other social movements that have successfully caused extraordinary change, especially when they were in the face of all odds being against them. And I want to look at some of the milestones that these movements made in achieving these massive changes, and also look at their long histories, and then consider where we are in the struggle for animal rights and our history. So I'm going to look at three examples, the first of which is the child labor movement. This happened I'm going to specifically focus on the US. And for most of our history, children had absolutely no rights. They were largely considered property. They were literally owned by their parents, who exerted complete and absolute power and authority over them. Now, the societal view of children started to shift during the Age of Enlightenment. The first acts of children's rights activism were actually sanctuaries. They were sanctuaries for abused, neglected, and abandoned children. This is a picture of the founding hospital in London, which was founded in 1741. And this was a children's home for education and maintenance of exposed and deserted young children. And the use of child labor increased during the Industrial Revolution, and this became the focus of the children's rights movement. This was basically their battle cry. And the movement, the children's rights movement, largely focused on welfare reforms. In the 1800s, the UK passed the Factories Act, which was basically a series of labor laws to improve the welfare of children working in factories. And the early acts concentrated on basically just limiting work hours. At first, they limited the work hours to 16 hours a day. I mean, I don't know how these children were working any more than that, but that was the starting point. I mean, we're talking about extreme basic welfare at this time. They also worked to improve the conditions that the children were working in. And these laws were effectively unenforced, even after they were passed. After they were on the books, they were effectively unenforced for many years. Sound familiar? And they basically went unenforced until about 1833, when there was basically an enforcement act that was passed. And similar to the laws in the UK, the US started adopting some of these laws in about 1836, the first of which happened in Massachusetts. And basically, this law said if you're going to put your child into forced hard labor, you at least have to send them to school for 3 months out of the year. And then over the next 90 years, there's basically no notable progress, at least on any legislative level or any institutional level. But something very, very important happened during this period. There were some marginal welfare measures passed during this time, but public support for children's rights really started to grow. And also, the number of organizations for children's rights just absolutely exploded. And in 1915, a coalition of about 70 children's rights groups came together. They were called the Child Welfare League. And they all focused all of their efforts under this unified mission of developing child welfare in the workforce. And then in about 1924, there was an attempt to pass an amendment to the US Constitution to authorize a national child labor law. However, this law, which would have just given children very, very basic protections in the workplace, was blocked by Congress. So think about that. This was a measure just to give children some basic protections when they're being forced into hard labor. And government officials were openly opposing this. I mean, they were in public saying, no, we are going to defend putting children into hard labor, and we want to give them absolutely no protection whatsoever. And this was less than 100 years ago this happened. Then about 20 years later, in 1938, we saw a huge breakthrough. And we basically saw the beginning of a landslide of, it was about 50 years, of children's rights coming out, just getting stronger and stronger with everyone that came out. And this included the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Declaration of Rights of the Child, and many other very strong children's rights acts. And all of these laws were eventually ratified throughout all the states and on a national level as well. And then in 1989, the United Nations codified a range of child's rights into international law, with almost every single country in the entire world eventually ratifying it. Another example I want to take a look at is the struggle for women's rights. Particularly, I want to look at women's suffrage. In 1777, just 1 year after the United States was founded, one of the first things that ever happened in our country was women started to lose the right to vote. And then by 1807, 30 years later, every single state had banned women from the right to vote. Now, in the 1700s, there was some suffrage progress. Limited voting rights were granted to women in Sweden, in Corsica, and the British Crown, and in a single state in the US. But by the 1800s, almost all of these were rescinded. Almost all of them were just wiped off the books. Then in the US in 1838, Kentucky became the first state to pass a statewide women's suffrage law. And this was basically giving women a limited scope of voting rights. Only certain women were allowed to vote. But this was pretty monumental progress considering what happened before this. Then in 1848, the Women's Rights Convention, the first one ever, was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And women's suffrage was proposed as the main campaign that the movement should focus on. And at this conference, they agreed that the movement was going to make this their primary focus. They're going to engage in other types of women's rights activism, but their main campaign, their public-facing campaign, their main one was going to be women's suffrage. And then in 1869, we saw a very, very historic victory in the territory of Wyoming, and they were the first state ever to grant unrestricted suffrage to women. So immediately we started seeing progress after the movement aligned on this one issue. However, in 1875, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution actually does not grant women the right to vote. So basically, the government had decided that in the US Constitution, women were not protected, and this basically just erased all of the progress, like all those decades of progress and work that the women's rights movement put into this, was just basically erased with, with the stroke of a pen. And this was decided at the absolute highest level of government. And just imagine how the women felt during this time, after having a movement that lasted for decades, dedicating their lives to this change, and then in an instant, it was just all gone. And after this, there was, as you can imagine, a pretty deafening silence in terms of progress, and this lasted for a number of decades as well. But what did these women do? Did they give up at this time? No, like quite the contrary. Like when things got worse for them, they actually started working harder. The movement worked even harder. And in 1913, Alice Paul organized the largest ever march on Washington for women's rights. It was the largest one to date. And the parade was attacked by a mob, and hundreds of women were injured in this. in this attack. But not one single arrest was made. Like, that is just a reflection of the attitude of society at the time. And then in 1918, exactly 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would prohibit the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens in the United States based on sex, was rejected by the United States Congress. Very, very similar to the child labor movement. Congress, openly debated this, and they decided that, no, we still feel that women should not have the right to vote. However, just 2 years later, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified, stating that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. And finally, in 1984, Mississippi became the last state in the Union to ratify the 19th Amendment. And today, the fight for women's equality continues. This was just one step. This was a stepping stone that, in the ultimate right and liberation of women. It's not like the women that were fighting for suffrage, once they achieved that, they just said, okay, yeah, we got what we wanted, time to go home, retire. But I mean, look at this timeline. This was a 207-year struggle of, full of campaigning, hostility towards the movement, victories along the way, major losses. I mean, progress was not linear. Like, this movement experienced very big setbacks. And this was all just for a basic right, or a right as basic to just have some say in public policy in the women's own society. Finally, I want to take a look at what I think is another really great example of social progress, and that is the gay rights movement. Now, for most of our history, the gay community was highly persecuted. The penalty for being gay, just for existing, was anywhere between a fine, imprisonment, castration, and death. Because of this, as early as the turn of the 20th century, several groups, several advocacy groups, had to work in hiding. And because of that, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about them or what they were doing at the time. So very little is known about them other than that there were groups that existed during this time. However, the first organization in recorded history, anyway, was the Society for Human Rights in Chicago. And this became the country's earliest known gay rights organization in 1924. During the late 1940s and 1960s, a handful of radio and television news programs aired episodes where they featured homosexuals as stars on the show, or just maybe making appearances, or just discussed homosexuality on television and radio. And during this time, the movement, which was actually called the homophile movement, they wanted to try to get away from sex being associated with the gay rights movement, because at the time, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. Homosexuals were considered, at best, deviants or perverts. So there were some organizations that were founded, the very first national organizations that were founded for gay rights, really focused on assimilating gays into mainstream culture, just making it acceptable, at least a little bit, to society, showing that just because you're gay doesn't mean you're going to go assault someone's child or something like that. So this was what the movement really focused on in the early days. At this time, there was also legislative efforts in Chicago. And in the first major victory of the movement, Illinois became the first state in the US to decriminalize homosexual acts. So again, basically making it legal to exist if you're gay. I mean, talk about basic welfare. That was a major achievement at the time. Also during this time, there was widespread harassment and persecution of the gay community that existed all throughout history, but this was still continuing in modern society and came to quite a boiling point. And the gay community said, you know what, that's it, we're fighting back now. And in the 1960s, police raids became very popular. So police would raid a gay bar and they would just go in and beat everyone up, arrest people for no reason, things like that. And in 1969, they picked the wrong bar. They went into a bar in New York called the Stonewall Inn, and this sparked a huge uproaring. So everyone in the bar said, you know what, fuck this, we're fighting back. And this sparked 3 days worth of very, very intense riots. And this was a very, very pivotal point in history. The Stonewall Riots really transformed the movement. So the movement went from being extremely marginalized, just very few small groups working around the country, to just being an extremely widespread protest all across the country, demanding equal rights and acceptance in society. And as a consequence, similar to what we saw in the movements previously discussed, there was this point where there was this bubbling up of organizations, where all these new organizations started coming into existence. And this was a really important point in the gay movement. So the gay rights movement spread across the country, and out of this vein came a number of advocacy organizations taking various different approaches. There was the Gay Liberation Front, who advocated for sexual liberation. Their theory was that homophobia basically stemmed from people being repressed sexually. And then there was also the Human Rights Campaign that came into existence in 1980, and they advocated welfare reforms on an institutional level. And then there was also groups like the National LGBTQ Task Force, which really focused, they took more of a grassroots educational approach, distributing leaflets and things like that. And then we saw some legislative progress in cities. Many cities had anti-discrimination laws protecting people from being denied basic things like housing, education, and healthcare, just on the basis of being gay. So you can't, there were very basic laws, like if you were gay and you went into a hospital, they couldn't say, oh, we're sorry, we're not gonna serve you, you're gay. You can leave now. So again, very, very basic anti-discrimination laws. And then in 1977, Harvey Milk, who you may know of from the movie Milk, he was the first openly gay elected official in the history of California. And he defeated this initiative to reverse this anti-discrimination law in his city in San Francisco. And he won. This was basically, this was the battleground for the gay rights movement at the time. So, the gay rights movement was starting to make this progress. They had these very basic laws on the books, just protecting from minimal discrimination. And, they were the anti-gay movement tried to reverse this. And Harvey Milk ended up defeating this reversal. And this was a huge win. I mean, an absolutely monumental win for the gay rights movement at the time. The New York Times called it the most stringent and encompassing gay rights law in the nation, and its passing demonstrated the growing political power of homosexuals. However, after that, there was this huge backlash all across the country. So basically it took one step forward and then huge step back. After this, 9 states and 82 cities introduced initiatives to reverse gay rights laws, just to erase them off the books. Sadly, 62 of them passed. Very similar to the women's movement, the children's rights movement. In just one felt swoop, decades of progress was just erased. I mean, imagine how that must have felt at the time. Imagine how people felt at the time. Well, then things got even worse. A little over 30 years ago, in 1996, we're talking about when Nirvana was popular. The United States Congress enacted the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically forbade the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriages. And sadly, this passed as well. So during this time, hate crimes were also steadily increasing. So this was a very, very demoralizing point in the movement's history. However, during this time, we did see the revival of decriminalization laws. So again, just basically fighting for the right to exist. And by 2013, every state, you were allowed to be gay. And now basically they passed laws decriminalizing homosexuality. Then in 2009, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act expanded in the United States to a federal level. So again, just slowly taking those incremental steps. Then in 2011, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law is repealed. So basically this was a law that like, okay, yeah, we'll let gays in the military as long as they don't talk about it, as long as they don't admit that they're gay, they can come and fight with us. They ended up reversing this in 2011, so now gay people were allowed to be open and be in the military. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed between same-sex couples, a ruling that President Obama called a victory for America. And just like the other movements, it's not like when they were making these incremental reforms, once they achieved them, it's not like they just threw up their hands and said, we're done. They moved on to the next issue. And today, the gay rights movement, they achieved same-sex marriage rights, but they didn't stop there. I mean, today, the gay rights movement now is fighting for employment discrimination rights. So that's you can't be fired for being gay, that they can get the same benefits as straight people. They're still continuing this effort for total liberation, but they did this through this incremental change. Now, one thing that I think all of these movements have in common is, one, that the idea, the philosophy is just completely marginalized. The movement is marginalized. These movements are trying to reverse sometimes millennia of prejudice deeply ingrained into the culture. And the cause for that reason is just extremely unpopular. I mean, the idea that they're fighting for is just so unpopular. They also have extremely long histories. I mean, some of these movements spanned hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And as I was saying before, the progress of these movements are not always linear. I mean, all of these movements experienced huge setbacks, just enormous setbacks that, I mean, I think if we experienced today, I think everyone in here would just want to give up if we experience something that these movements experience. These movements are also highly diversified, and we saw a point in each of their histories where there was this explosion of organizations coming out of the woodwork. And also the public-facing battle cry of all of these movements was incremental reform. It's like this pragmatic ask that slowly moved the bar throughout history until they achieved fundamental rights. So now I want to take a look at the animal rights movement and kind of consider for a minute where we are in our history and see if we see any of these types of patterns that we saw in these other movements. So the idea for animal rights is nothing new. Greek philosopher Pythagoras, probably best known for his Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He was kind of the first in line of several Greek and Roman philosophers who argued that humans aren't the only ones to have souls. And he advocated on vegetarianism based on ethical grounds. Then in the 1600s, we kind of saw the rise of human exceptionalism. Descartes maintained that animals cannot reason, they don't feel pain. Yeah, they're living organic biological creatures, but they're basically no different than like a clock on the wall. They can't feel anything. And unfortunately, this became extremely popular. This is an idea that's still very deeply ingrained in our societies today. In the 1700s, we saw the rise of utilitarianism, where philosopher Jeremy Bentham just basically flipped Descartes on his head and said, you know what, no, I think you're totally wrong. It doesn't matter if these animals can reason. It doesn't matter if they're intelligent or not. What matters is that they can suffer. Then in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origins of Species, basically demonstrating that humans are the evolutionary descendants of non-human animals. And this was very, very important for helping kind of dismantle human exceptionalism. And then in terms of the movement in the US, the very, very first animal protection movement in the US was the American Society for the Protection or the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. This basically happened after the RSPCA started in the UK. And then in 1975, we saw the publishing of Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. Now, many people mark this as the kind of what sparked the modern day animal rights movement. I'm a very big fan of Peter Singer's work. His book was very, very influential in my personal life. So I went and saw him speak when I first got into animal rights work. And when, this was an animal rights conference in the US sometime in the early 2000s. And when I saw him speak, something really funny happened actually. A spider landed on his head while he was talking. And he kind of like reflectively just like smashed it. He just felt something on his head, smashed it. And granted, this was like in a room full of animal rights advocates. So he had a lot of explaining to do after that. So he was, of course, asked about insect suffering. Do we think this is something we all have to consider? But this also, led to questions about like chickens, and he expressed his opinion on society's view of chickens and thought that it would be very difficult to ever make progress for chickens in the same way for cows and pigs because they're not as expressive creatures. Well, I want to take a minute to show how wrong I think Peter Singer was about that. But before I do that, I want to get into some of the history of the animal rights movement in the US. Shortly after this book was published, the militant underground animal rights group, Animal Liberation Front, is founded in Britain and then quickly spreads over into the US. Also, we saw the founding of very early animal rights groups like PETA and Farm, and I'm not listed up here, Farm Sanctuary. And at this time, animal rights was so highly ridiculed in society, it was very difficult to get attention for these issues. So groups like PETA, who have probably a very bad reputation today, they had to do kind of extreme public stunts to get attention for animals back then. I think they're still doing that, but back then that was like their only choice. And then in the early 2000s, inspired from Australian activist Paddy Mark, who started the open rescue movement in the 1990s, and Martin Bollock of VGT, who at the time was campaigning to end cages in Austria. We saw these undercover investigations start to come out in the US, focusing on chickens. Like their focus was to go into battery cage farms and do these open rescues, take chickens out of the farms that were suffering and rescue them, and then publicize and do this totally open, with no mask or anything like that. The first one happened in Maryland, about 40 minutes from my house, actually. And this really marked the beginning of the battle for chickens in the US. Also, prior to 2005, basically there was no focus on farmed animals in the US. Largely, groups were focusing on anti-vivisection, anti-fur, anti-circus campaigns, things like that. In 2005, we started to see groups shift their focus to things like vegan outreach and institutional reforms for animals, for farmed animals. And then after 2005, we saw groups like Compassion and World Farming enter the US, Animal Equality, and the Humane Society of the United States started their farm animal protection department. And this really shifted the focus of the entire movement, again, towards now helping farm animals. And similar to how the women's rights movement got together and decided that their focus was going to be on a unified issue, the major groups in the US got together and decided that the focus of the movement is going to be to eliminate these intensive confinement practices like battery cages, veal crates and gestation crates, things like that. Shortly after that, we started seeing very, very quick success. We saw several states in the United States ban, first they started banning gestation crates, then we saw some put restrictions and bans on cages for egg-laying hens. And then in more recent history, in about 2015, we just saw a huge breakthrough with corporations announcing that they're phasing cages out of their supply chains, and really marking the first major turning point in the movement's history. Now with over 1,000 major food companies having 100% cage-free policies. And now we're also starting to see stronger legislation come out. So at first they said, okay, we're going to ban the production. Now we're going back into these same states and saying now we're going to ban the sale of these products that come from animals kept in cages. And now to present day, we're starting to see major signs of societal change. SeaWorld announced that they're ending their whale show. So the idea of using animals for entertainment is starting to now become rejected by society. We saw this with the collapse of Ringling Brothers Circus, the largest circus in the United States. It's been around for 150 years, announced that they are shutting down, citing the concern for animals as one of their major reasons for doing so. More recently, we saw Los Angeles announce that they're banning the sale of fur. Los Angeles, this is where Hollywood is located. I mean, this is a huge shift in our cultural thinking. And now we're starting to see the rise of plant-based alternatives come out, like Just Mayo. We're starting to see in vitro meat, lots of funding to go into this technology and this research. We're seeing the biggest meat producers in the world starting to invest into plant-based companies, just accepting the fact that plant-based foods or vegan foods are at least going to be a major part of the future, if not the future itself. And then I was up in Canada recently, and I just want to tell you an anecdotal story real quick. But I went into A&W. It's kind of like a shitty fast food restaurant, kind of like McDonald's. And they just started using the Beyond Burgers. They started featuring this. They just announced that their Beyond Burgers, their vegan burgers, are now outselling their meat burgers. This is at a fast food restaurant. This is happening. So we're really starting to see this gradual process, this incremental change, really come into play. And we're starting to see what the theory that Martin Balloch famously came up for, of using this incremental change to ultimately cause greater societal change and eventually some rights for animals. And we're seeing in some countries are now in the later stages of this graph. Some country, depends on which country you're in, but we are seeing some countries in the later stages of this graph. So we're starting to see this come into fruition. And finally, there is a day out there, one day on our calendar, that we will see an end of factory farming. We'll see the end of animals being used for our entertainment, for our pleasure. There's a day out there. It could be 5 years from now. It could be 100 years from now. It could be 2,000 years from now. But how soon that day comes and what happens in the first second of the next cosmic calendar, January 1st of the next year's cosmic calendar, really depends on all of us and what we do and how we respond to challenges and setbacks that we will experience as a movement. So thank you all for spending your weekend dedicated to animals. Thank you.
We have time for just a couple questions.
Thanks. Thank you for that very inspirational talk. I was wondering if you could comment on some of the differences between the movements. So we're fighting for someone else and not ourselves. And obviously we have maybe an advantage in the fact that we have social media, which the other movements did not have.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of parallels, but there are, as you mentioned, I think a lot of huge differences. Yeah, as you said, we're fighting for someone else. I mean, that's a huge disadvantage for us. The animals can't speak for themselves, obviously. But yeah, in terms of differences, other than that, I mean, I think we're starting to see, like, in terms of the grander patterns, I think all the same patterns are totally there. But I think we do have a bigger challenge on our hand because of that. But you know, despite that being said, I think we're starting to see our movement is like moving at lightning speed when you really examine it. I mean, if you consider the modern animal rights movement to be when Peter Singer published his book in 1975, I think we were moving at extremely rapid progress. But I think another difference that we have is we're also riding on the coattails of, at least in the US, we're riding on the coattails of the civil rights movement. So I think because of their success, I think that gave us also an advantage. As you said, other things like the advent of the internet.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Are there any cases or examples of movements that exhibited these patterns and failed? Or do all the movements who have some humane agenda eventually succeed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not really sure. This is an issue that I started researching about a year ago. And you know, as a disclaimer, I'm not a historian by any means. So yeah, I'm still looking into this, but from what I've found so far, just like the movements that have succeeded have all used this incremental reform approach.
Thank you. So we are seeing a very big growth in the animal rights movement, right? But in the lecture before, lecturer actually said that number of vegans isn't increasing, which is going against all my beliefs. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because all I'm seeing is growth, you know? And how are we going to see a vegan world if the number of vegans isn't growing? So I'm just confused a little bit.
Yeah, we're seeing this in the US as well. We're seeing kind of the number of vegans stagnate, at least according to data as recent as 2016. There's been maybe some increase, but I don't know how complete that data is. But one thing is for sure, that the change that we're seeing is for animals is not really coming from vegans. It's coming from mainstream society. So we're seeing non-vegans start to change their behaviors in terms of diet and also their attitudes towards animals, which is a trend I think we want to see. Like, I think we want to see society start to move closer to veganism until they do get there. So I think in one sense it's a good thing. On the other hand, yeah, if it's true, if those stats are true about veganism not increasing, I don't know what that means or what that is, or what the cause of that is. I'm not sure.
Thank you. That was a great talk. How big an impact is climate change going to make in this movement? It seems like a very feasible incentive for people to go vegan.
Yeah, I think that, you know, people change their diets and their behaviors for many reasons. I think the fact that we have climate change on our side is a very good thing, and I think we're going to hit a point where we just have to make changes in our food system, whether people want to or not. So I think that's a very good thing.
Okay, let's thank Aaron for his talk.
Thank you.